Keep Up the Fire is the new installment in the State of Siege series by Victory Point Games. This is a series that I've enjoyed in the past, so I was curious to try a new installment. The game is set during the Boxer Rebellion in China in summer 1900. The AI of the board takes the role of the Chinese forces that are trying to eliminate foreign devils, and you take the role of the foreign devils, that is, of the international legations that are sieged in Beijing. They are trying to survive against an overwhelming number of enemies until the relief column comes to their rescue. However, and this is an interesting twist on what you may expect from a State of Siege game. Here the player also plays the role of the relief column, so you have to lead the relief column as it fights its way through China to reach Beijing before it is too late, before there are no survivors to rescue anymore. So interesting idea here, but this game really introduces a couple of interesting and original concepts to the series, but well, let's take a look. Like in other games in the State of Siege series, here the resources available to the player and the actions executed by the AI of the board are determined using a deck of event cards. Before you start the game, you will draw 3 of these cards randomly, and you don't look at them, and you put away the other 3 ones, again, without looking at them, so you do not know the ones that you have. So from game to game, you will have different combinations of special cards. You take those 3 cards, you shuffle them in here, shuffle, 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 and then you place this deck face down. Then you repeat the same thing here, 3 of them, don't look at them, shuffle them in here, and then you place this deck on top of the other one, and you have the deck ready to start. Also, you have some cards that you had to place in specific positions, but this is the general idea. This is the tactical section of the map that represents the compound that the 8 international legations are trying to defend against the waves and waves of Chinese attackers. Here in the middle of the tactical display, you have 8 boxes where you will place the markers corresponding to the 8 legations. The game really has an interesting tactical aspect because, as you can see from the markers for the legations, each legation has a different power or ability, or sometimes a weakness. So these markers do work differently, do play differently, and during the game you will be moving them around, following certain rules and restrictions to be able to exploit their abilities or to defend them in certain ways when some of them are particularly weak because of several reasons that, well, can make them weak. So it's pretty interesting. You have that tactical aspect in which you have to exploit the abilities of your legations well. In the middle of the map, you have Fort Halliday, which is the area that they're trying to defend the most, because if an enemy unit enters that space, then you lose the game immediately. And departing from there, there are 4 tracks going in different directions, and those are the tracks that the enemy units will use to advance against you. At the beginning of a new turn, you will draw a new event card, and the first thing that you do is you look at this compass that tells you if you need to add new enemies to the map. The compass tells you the tracks that you need to check and where you need to add a new unit in case there isn't one already. If there is one, you just ignore that. The symbol also tells you the type of enemy that you need to add. Yellow symbols indicate units of the Qing army, which are usually stronger, not always, but usually stronger than the boxers, and also better trained and more disciplined. And red symbols represent the boxers, which are not always as strong as the Qing units, but they fight much more ferociously. They take more damage and inflict more damage. Also, the number you see there represents the initial combat power of that unit. For example, if I had just drawn this card and there are no units on the map, then I need to add a Qing unit to this track here. I place the unit there at the beginning of the track, and I also record a combat power of 5. Then I need to add another Qing unit here on that other map there, and the combat power is also 5. And then I add a boxer unit here with a combat power of 5, and that's it for now. After the placement of new enemy units, then your legations get to act, and the card will tell you the number of actions available to the legations for that turn. For one action, you can add 1 point to your fortification level, and you can have up to 4 fortification points at any one time, and then those points will be spent later to absorb hits during melee combat. For one action, you can attack an enemy which is at extreme or long range by using a ranged attack. To perform a range attack, you roll 1d6. That result may be modified by abilities of the units. For example, the Italians get +1 when they're firing at extreme range. American and French units get +1 when they're firing at long range. If the modified result is equal to or less than the present combat power of the unit you're firing at, then nothing happens. That attack is just a miss. If the modified result is more than the present combat power, then you deal a hit. Then you roll another die. You may modify that based on distance, and the modified result is the number of hits that you inflict, and then you just lower the combat power of that unit by the modified result. That may eliminate the unit. In that case, you just remove it from the track, or it may not. It may be just weaken the unit. In this case, and this is very important, it's different from other State of Siege games, the unit, even with the reduced combat power, will keep advancing. It doesn't retreat, it doesn't even slow down. During the movement phase, all Chinese units will advance by 1 box towards the central space. So you will have to attack it again. And of course, the second time that you attack a unit after you've reduced it, it is much easier to hit it, because now the combat power is down to 2. You can hit it with a modified number that is more than 2, with a modified 3. Now that would be sufficient. Still, you had to spend multiple actions, because unless you eliminate them, these units never stop coming. For one action, you can declare a melee attack against an enemy unit, which is in this space here, the walls, or here in the streets. Then you roll to see if you hit. No? Just kidding, you don't roll to see if you hit when there is a gruesome melee going on in such a constricted space. People are going to get hit, people on both sides are going to suffer. So in a melee attack, and this is the cool thing, it's pretty terrifying, but it's pretty cool. On that hand, you just roll to check for casualties. So you just roll a die, and the number that you roll, oh look, I rolled a 3, is the base number that is used to determine casualties on the enemy units and on your legation units. And Chinese units and legations will end up often having different number of casualties, because different modifiers will apply. For example, boxers fight very fanatically, just like madmen. They throw themselves in the fight, so actually you will have to add +1 casualty to the casualties that they take, but also to the casualties that they inflict on the legation. If the fighting happens in the street, same thing, +1 casualty to the Chinese units and to your units, but then some of your units will inflict an extra casualty in melee. Also, as you can see here, the walls may absorb some of the casualties taken by the legations. You will use this section of the map to keep track of the combat power of your legations. The initial combat power of each legation is determined by setup instructions. Then during the game, you will reduce the combat power of the units using this track, depending on the number of casualties that units involved in melee take. When a legation goes down to 0 combat points, then the corresponding marker is removed from the tactical display. That unit cannot participate in the fight anymore, unless later receives reinforcements, but that may or may not happen. And if all of your combat markers go down to 0 and all of your legations are eliminated from the map, well, I think you can guess what happens then. Meanwhile, far from Beijing, the 8th Nation Army is trying to march and come to the rescue of the legations that are sieged in the compound in Beijing. The second part of the turn will represent this attempt. After you have resolved the top part of the card, then you look at the bottom card and you move on to this inset here on the map. You will have the number of commands that you can issue to your army, and there may be other instructions here. It depends on the card. At the beginning of this part of the turn, you will draw an enemy marker from the cup. The number and quality of the enemy markers will change during the game as instructed by the cards. Oh, this is a very tough one. Anyways, the one that you draw, you will place on top of the army marker, and that indicates the enemy unit that is trying to stop your army for that turn. At the end of the turn, you put it back in the cup, and each time you draw a new one. Now, for one command, you can move one of your markers, combat or speed, by one box on their track, and you're trying basically to gain these bonuses. So you spend command after command to improve your combat skills and your speed value. For another command, you can attack the enemies that are stopping you. What you do at that point is you roll 1d6, you add the combat bonus that you may have at that point. If the modified result is more than the combat strength of the enemy, in this case would be a 7, then the enemy is dispersed, and in that turn you can try to advance. By spending another action, you will have a check here on the speed section of your inset, and if you are successful at that point, you can advance. So first you have to remove the enemy, then you roll to advance. You roll 1d6, you apply the modifiers. If you rolled more than 6, then you can advance. So you have to roll more than 6 with a 1d6. It tells you how easy it is to be successful in that check if you don't have good bonuses. However, things may not be as easy as I made them sound so far, because if you fail in your attempt to attack the enemies, or if you fail a speed check, then you suffer a loss. A loss will force you to lose a box, a square in both of your tracks, or 2 boxes on one of your tracks. So you really have to find the balance between waiting enough to have good bonuses to be able to advance, and then taking the chance to advance, because if you start too early, then the problem is that you will fail the checks and suffer losses. But if you wait too long, then the problem is that you may not be able to get there in time. So at the end of the day, you lose the game if a Chinese unit enters the central space of the compound, if all of your legations are eliminated, or if the relief column fails to reach Beijing before you exhaust the deck of event cards. And you win only if the relief column reaches Beijing before any of the previous applies. The game is tough. It is extremely hard to win, and I'd say at the beginning it is also hard to really figure out how to use all your options well, because it's a game that really is swarming with options and things to do. It has a very intense tactical feel to it. Think about it. You have 8 legations that all have different abilities. They fight differently from one another. They have different starting amounts of combat power. That means there are different numbers of hits, casualties that they can take, so you have to budget that. The location of the map is extremely important, because sending them against an enemy is very different than against another one. Also, certain areas of the wall will offer better protection or worse protection for your legations. So just so many factors you have to take into account, that the first couple of games I couldn't really, use all of these things to my advantage, and the game ended in the first couple of turns with a bloodbath for me. And then you really start seeing the depth that the game has to offer, and that is when the game really starts being incredibly fun. The game is just so rich in tough decisions, will create very nail-biting moments, a lot of tension. It really is a game that almost has an hypnotic power. The game is also more involved, more absorbing than other State of Siege series games. At the same time, it's not more complicated in terms of rules. The rule book seems to me of the same length of most of the other books in the series. If anything, there are very lengthy examples. I believe that the amount of rules that you need to learn to play the game may be lower than the rules that you have in other games in the series, but just the complexity of gameplay, the complexity of executing the right actions that you have to choose in a vast range, that is where the game really shines. And this may not make it the ideal game to be introduced to the series. I think it is possible, but there are probably other games that are less brutal and less demanding that you may start from. Overall, however, this is a game that I've enjoyed a lot. A game that really keeps me hooked, that really creates incredible moments of tension, a very strong narrative. It's very intense, it's very involved. I love it. I think it is a superb new title in what already was an excellent series.